Hello and welcome to this webinar, Podcasting Now and in the Future, with me, Richard Miron. It's a pleasure to be talking to you at Imprensa. A little bit about me to begin with. I began my career many years ago as a producer with BBC Radio in London. I then went on to become a reporter and a foreign correspondent. I left the BBC after a number of years to go and work for the United Nations as a spokesman and a senior communication official in the Middle East. I then went on to become a senior communication official with the World Bank in Washington, DC. That was in 2012. And a couple of years after being there, podcasts began to become very popular in the US. There was a breakthrough podcast called Serial, which I think got something like over 40 million downloads. And I began to think from my position that there was something in this for smaller audiences. And I did a series just internally for World Bank staff, in which World Bank people who had authored books were interviewed by me. That small experiment led to me founding my consultancy, Earshot Strategies, in London, where I'm now based. And it's become, in a way, the object of all my professional endeavors. I really believe in podcasts as a form of communication, not just for corporations, for organizations, for anybody who wants to convey thought leadership. It's something that I'm truly passionate about. So in this webinar, I'm going to be addressing a number of questions. And these are, in order: what are podcasts? Why should you care about them? Why are they so important? And what comes next? What is the future for podcasts? Let me just take that first question. What are they? So for me, podcasts are the audio campfire around which people gather. They're intimate. They exchange stories, they exchange ideas. And this goes to the core of partly why I think podcasts are so successful, and partly why I like them so much, because they go to the core of who we are as human beings. We communicate through speech. We've been doing this, communicating through speech, since humans were humans, sitting around campfires wherever we were, sitting around huddled in groups. And podcasts are just the digitized version of that. They're the only form of media, also, when you think about it, that you can consume when you're doing something else. So I listen to my podcast when I'm walking the dog or when I'm running. You can't do that when you're reading something, when you're watching something. It's completely different. Podcasts also aren't about broadcasting. They're about narrowcasting. They're about groups, segmented groups, sharing thoughts and ideas. They're about people being able to communicate without the mediated gatekeepers of broadcasters. So podcasts, I think, are, as I say, they're a different form of media, even from radio, for which you need people, for which you need mediators, you need gatekeepers, and which tend to aim at a broad audience. So why should you care about podcasts? Why are they so important? Well, they're very popular. That's part of the reason why. Just looking at this graph here and seeing where they are so popular and how popular they are, 53% of people in South Korea listened to a podcast in the past month. South Korea is interesting, and I think the popularity of podcasts there can be partly explained by the ubiquitousness of smartphones. Samsung obviously being a Korean company, and the uptake of smartphones was well in advance of other countries and far more widespread. Spanish language podcasts are also popular in Latin America and in Spain, and also in the United States. You see there, as we get further down, you see the adoption of podcasts into the English-speaking world. They're the United States, Canada, Australia, and Britain coming along at the bottom there, the United Kingdom. Now, there is a question about why the UK only has 21% as compared to 35% of people who listen to a podcast every month in the US. And I think this is partially explained by the range of radio programs that you get from an organization like the BBC, which is a pretty well-funded public broadcaster. They've had documentaries and soap operas on radio, all sorts of things. And these tend to get put up as podcasts. I think that has to some degree inhibited the growth of podcasts. Now, of course, what about Brazil? What about Portuguese language podcasts? Well, Brazil is one of those countries which is experiencing enormous growth. in podcasts. Here's just some of the statistics that I found. Brazil saw podcast downloads grow by 33%. Let's just pause there for a moment. 33% in 1 year, in 2018. Monthly podcast consumption on Spotify has been growing by 21% in Brazil on average since 2018. And people in Brazil listen to a lot of podcasts. 2 hours, 52 minutes, we're told by the Brazilian Association of Podcasters. It's really quite impressive. And we're seeing this actually in other countries where the development of podcasts has been particularly rapid. It's begun a bit later maybe than the English-speaking world, but there is catch-up going on, an enormous sophistication also, and range in the kind of podcasts that are being offered. And in preparation for this, I did go on and have a look and investigate the kind of podcasts which are popular in Brazil. And here we can see some of them, and I'm sure many of you are aware of some of these podcasts. I'm going to play a short extract, only a minute or two. And then I want to talk about how, whilst, of course, these are Brazilian, they also bear comparison to other podcasts that operate in other parts of the world. And there's a sort of template, if you will, which seems to operate for podcasts. I'm just going to play that, if you will. As I say, it's only about a minute and a half long.
Olá, está começando mais um Foro de Teresina, o podcast de política da revista Piauí.
Como o bloco existia para a indicação dos membros da CMO e isso já foi feito, não tinha mais sentido a manutenção do partido neste blocão.
Eu, Fernando de Barros e Silva, em minha casa em São Paulo, tenho o prazer de conversar com
Vozes da pandemia. Pessoas que perderam o filho, a mãe, o pai.
Ele era uma figura incrível. Meu pai tinha um caderninho de piada e assim o cartão de visita dele sempre era uma piada, sempre era uma conversa agradável. Meu pai era espetacular. Assim.
Um minuto, presidente. Senhor presidente. Um minuto, presidente.
Baixo Clero, o podcast de política do UOL.
Sou do Baixo Clero, sem qualquer problema, mas é um sinal que todos têm espaço aqui nesse maravilhoso Brasil.
Trip. Consciência. Uma produção da Trip. Apoio Instituto Serrapilheira.
Fernando, Rodrigo, muito obrigado por estarem presentes aqui em mais um Trip Consciência. E hoje a gente vai falar sobre biosfera, o tema do programa de hoje.
Olá, eu sou o Carlos Merigo, esse é o Braincast número 362. Estou aqui hoje com Bia Fiorotto.
Olá, Braincasters.
Ana Freitas.
Braincasters.
Você está ouvindo Nerdcast no Jovem Nerd.
Landa, nerds! Aqui é Alexandre Antônio do Jovem Nerd cumprindo uma promessa.
Aqui é o Guga, I'm just a little silhouette of a man.
Aqui é o Américo Fazio falando e eu queria muito ter escrito Bohemian Rhapsody.
So there you have it. And what I find really interesting there is the range of podcasts, the way in which science is popularized in there, the way in which on Nerdcast you hear from people who are fanatics of the band Queen, but also some very serious and weighty stuff from Usando there, which I gather is obviously produced by Globo, but bears a strong comparison to The Daily from the New York Times. And if forgive my pronunciation here, Foro de Teresina, which is also similar to the kind of podcast that you'd find, for example, from New Yorker. The tone is often informal, it's personal, it's intimate, it's emotional. It can be, it doesn't have necessarily the formality and the respect or whatever you might term that you would find on terrestrial broadcasts. And there's a freedom, and some might even say a slight edge of anarchy to the world of podcasting. But certainly the range of programs there, the kind of programs you're hearing there, you do hear in English language podcasts, and I'm sure in other languages also. And the barrier to people making these kinds of podcasts are quite low. Really all you need is, you don't even need a studio these days, you need a decent recorder and you need some software and you can make a podcast. But you do need some sophistication and understanding of what listeners want and how to construct that program. But all these are great examples of great programs and the range of programs that podcasts are able to offer to many different kinds of people, from, as I say, Queen fanatics to people who are interested in science or technology or innovation or whatever. There's also something quite interesting about the podcast audience, and unfortunately I don't have the data here on Brazil, but I would be very unsurprised if the kind of demographics we see for podcast audiences elsewhere aren't reflected in Brazil. Now here we have from the USA, and what we generally see is that podcast audiences are higher educated, they have higher educational qualifications, and they tend to be more affluent than most of the population. For advertisers, this is great, of course. And it also targets, you find, podcasting, the decision makers. This isn't true across the board. We've seen very, very popular podcasts in sport and in other areas. And I think we are going to see a broadening generally of the podcast audience. But in its initial stages, and this is true in the English-speaking world, and I would imagine it's also true in Brazil, you're seeing a certain demographic being overrepresented. And that has an advantage if you want to hit those who are, as I say, the decision makers. There's one thing about podcasts, and I mentioned this earlier, which I think is very different. Of course, as I said, you can't engage with podcasts, or rather you engage with podcasts in a different way from the way in which you engage with other forms of media. You can be doing something else when you're listening to a podcast. Now, there's some research carried out by the BBC, and it engaged some neuroscientists, and they found out that most people naturally consume podcasts while they're doing other tasks. But more than that, the fact that they were doing other tasks made them more receptive to what was being said in the podcasts. There's always been this very close relationship between audio, between radio, and those who listen to it. Between radio hosts, people feel as if they know them. It's even more so with podcasts, because you are listening to a podcast generally through earphones, and that creates a very personal kind of relationship with the program, with the hosts, and so on. And one of the things this study found out was that listeners create subconscious associations with brands. This is branded podcasts they're talking about, based on words they hear in the podcast. In the sample carried out in this study, the word innovative was mentioned 12 times during the podcast. Listeners were later more likely to call the sponsor of that podcast innovative, showing that they instinctively associated the brand with the message. Podcasts are powerful. Podcasts are able to get to people far more deeply, I really believe this, than other forms of media. Which is why branded podcasts, of course, have become very popular. This is where commercial brands or others are using podcasts as a means of getting to consumers. And here I've got a few examples. So there's one, Awake at Night. This is put up by the UN, and it's about people who work for the UN and their experiences. They could be field workers with the UN High Commission for Refugees or others, and it's aimed at their donor community. Fortune favors the bold. This was created with MasterCard by a commercial podcasting organization, and the whole idea here was to look at the nature of money. It's a very clever podcast. One of the things you find about branded podcasts is the brand is often not put front and center. So Championing Women's Voices, that series there, is put out by a British bank, and that presenter there is a well-known presenter in the UK who has nothing to do with finance. And so you don't see the name, the brand or whatever of this bank, but it's the power of the content which is going front and center. And the same thing with the Discovery Adventures. This is an immersive drama put out by Land Rover, the car maker. And yet you can't see any emblem of Land Rover. Originally, it actually was put in the top right-hand corner, where you can now see British Podcast Awards. So they actually removed their own emblem and replaced it with something else because they felt that would be intrusive. Single Swipe Repeat, that is from Tinder, the dating app, and Cosmopolitan, aimed at single women. And interestingly there, when life gives you melons, this is by a British lingerie company, and it was aimed solidly at 20-something-year-old women and presented by a social media star. They decided that podcast was the best way of reaching this particular demographic. And again, you don't see the name, you see only the name of the lingerie firm, Freya, further down there. The content is all important. That is what makes the podcast. If you make a good podcast, people will associate your name of your organization or whatever with it. But if you try and I think put the marketing too strongly at the front of your podcast, I think you're going to put off more people than you will attract. And I think we are going to see more and more of these branded podcasts as time goes on. Now, I make not only branded, but also some niche podcasts. I'm aiming for a particular niche audience. And this is a representation of 3 different podcasts that I've made for 3 different organizations, very different organizations. Airbus, We Make It Fly. It was made for the Airbus aviation community, those involved in working in aviation, and to mark the company's 50th anniversary. And then you can see there Between Two Geeks. Now this was made for the World Bank, but again, you don't see the emblem of the World Bank. And it was meant to be about data and development. And it was meant to be fun. And in fact, it did very well. It got over 30,000 listens in talking about this subject of data and development in a new and innovative way. Community Conversations. This was for a crime fighting charity in the UK. It was to address the problem of knife crime in the UK, which has been a growing issue. And we did this by talking to people who were the victims of knife crime, or sometimes paramedics or whomever. 3 very different approaches. Now, the Community Conversations was aimed at policymakers. Between Two Geeks there was aimed at people who worked in development, and We Make It Fly was aimed at the aviation community. I'm going to play you, it's in English, I'm going to play you about 1.5 minutes just to give you an idea of these differing podcasts.
Welcome to Airbus.
Nothing was taken for granted. We were a startup, and so you had plenty of young people, dynamic, not already put into a mold of thinking, and just going out and let's do it, let's do it, let's do it.
That concludes this edition of We Make It Fly. This program was made by Earshot Strategies. Thanks for listening.
They were what I used to call my red shifts. And there's a lot of blood, isn't there, Teresa?
Yeah.
Depending how many times they've been stabbed or slashed and where the stabbing was. But they were my red shifts, and so you'd often go to bed at night and literally all you can see is red.
This podcast has been made for Crime Stoppers. I'm Richard Miron, and the producer is Anouk Mier. Thank you.
Hello, welcome to Between Two Geeks, the World Bank's podcast that dives into the data behind international development.
We've just had the warmest February here in Washington, D.C. on record. That's the kind of thing where I think, well, is that an anomaly? Is that just an unusual event? I mean, records will come and go. Or is it the start of a new pattern or reality? Is there something that's underlying which is making the weather here in D.C., the climate, a bit different?
So there you have those 3 examples. And just to give an idea, we've, in addition, made podcasts for organizations ranging from universities to think tanks, to the European Union, to a UN body on biodiversity, all range of subjects. And these are aimed, again, at very specific audiences. So sometimes it's not the size of the audience that matters, it's about getting to that specific group. And we've used various ways to do that through targeted advertising and through social media. And this is a whole subject altogether about the marketing and promotion of podcasts. It's very important, once you have made your podcast, to consider how you are going to get it to your specific audience. But you can see that you can take podcasts, as opposed to them being for a broad audience, to a very narrow audience. And where radio is for broadcasting, podcasts are indeed for narrowcasting, for hitting that narrow segment. And they can be done by thinking about what your audience wants, what interests them, What is going to make good content, and how are you going to tell your audience that this program exists? And this, I hope, is what we have been trying to do with the podcasts that we have been making at Earshot Strategies. And looking to the future, podcasts, I believe, are more important now than ever. We've seen during the pandemic how habits have changed a huge amount. And initially people said, well, obviously this is going to be very bad for podcasts because, for example, the commuter time where people used to listen to their podcasts, it's disappeared. And certainly we've seen changes in habits to podcasting, to the way in which people listen to podcasts. Some research done in the US suggested that people were listening to podcasts about 75 minutes later than they were a year ago. And this probably is because temporarily the way in which commuter habits have changed. Now, I'm going to say something quite controversial here, that I believe that the pandemic, in a way, has not fundamentally changed that much. What it has done is accelerated pre-existing trends and changes. And this is nowhere more true than it is with podcasts. Podcasts were growing. Podcasts are continuing to grow, and you are seeing this. For example, Acast, one of the major podcast hosting platforms, reported a 7% increase in listening in March. We have seen during the pandemic various genres, news, for example, current affairs podcasts, they fell away initially, I think because people wanted to listen to live news. And we saw, for example, all sorts of diversionary kind of podcasts, cooking and so on, rising in importance because of people where people found themselves. But overall, as I say, what I believe we're going to be seeing is an increase in podcasts because they address exactly what interests people. They address something fundamental within us. They provide us with, I think, brain food. And they do it in a way which completely conforms to our lifestyles, our busy, rushing around lifestyles where we want things on demand. You can go out at any time of day or night and you can listen to a podcast. As I say, your late night dog walk or your early morning run. And that is why I believe podcasts are going to be not just a fad, they're going to be a growing feature of the media landscape. And organizations, from traditional broadcasters to think tanks, to commercial organizations, to NGOs, to charities, all sorts, are going to be thinking about how can I deliver my thinking, what I am, who I am, what I've got to say via podcasts. So I hope to hear about the growth of podcasts from Brazil in future. I'm sure we will be hearing a great deal more about it. It's just a shame that, personally speaking, I'm unable to understand them. I do hope that if you are not doing podcasts at the moment, then you will go out and listen to podcasts and be entertained by them and stimulated by them and consider how your organization or you could undertake a podcast for a specific audience which is not being served. Thank you very much for your time. As I say, my name is Richard Miron and I come from Earshot Strategies. Thank you. Goodbye.